Chapter 8. Two Minds, One Vision. Vision is the art of seeing what is invisible to others. Jonathan Swift. Of all the experts who stepped up to the podium that day, only one was a layperson. Yet he drew the largest crowd. In a packed room of physicians, nurses, social workers, and psychologists. Many in the crowd had to lean against the walls to hear Steve Winter, a revolutionary in Alzheimer's care. He urged the audience, get the memory impaired up, dressed, and out of their rooms first thing in the morning. Untie the straps and belts that confine their bodies. Stop giving drugs that dull their psyches. Ban balloon toss, block stacking, and other childish pastimes. Fill their days with art classes, music jams, and other activities that matter. Haul away the vinyl couches, the linoleum tables, the metal seats. Move in fabric sofas and chairs, colorful curtains and paintings. Swing the doors wide open to welcome dogs, cats, birds, and children. Cheer as these people come back to life. With Steve's closing remarks, those attending the 1995 Alzheimer's Symposium at the University of California, San Diego stood to roar their approval. Dozens swarmed him with questions. I sat writing page after page of notes. Deep in thought, I stayed seated long after Steve had finished. I had never met Steve. I hadn't even heard of him. Since leaving my position at CPC, I had been determined to open a different place from those I had seen, one where the memory impaired could live up to their potential and enjoy life. I had never known there was someone else out there who thought the way I did. In his youth, Steve Winter had a fleeting brush with memory impairment. An aunt developed Alzheimer's disease and moved into a nursing home. Steve visited from time to time to break her daily routine of doing nothing. Only much later did Steve understand how stultifying her last years had been. The realization troubled him. Steve entered the University of Maryland planning to major in business. Soon after the school year began, he found a part-time job to help pay college expenses. The position as caregiver in a group home for the mentally disabled required him to work weekends, sleeping at the group home on Friday and Saturday nights. Weekdays would be free to study and attend classes. His first evening on the job, Steve made sure all the residents had turned in, and then he retired to the staff bedroom. In the early hours of the morning, he was jolted awake by loud conversation coming from the living room. As the vehement voices rose and fell, Steve pulled on his bathrobe and padded down the steps to find out why so many residents were up so early. When I walked into the room, I discovered just one person was there, Steve recalled. He was talking in 8 different voices. Not having been trained how to handle such a situation, he took a deep breath and went with his instinct. "Come on, William," he said gently. "It's really time for you to be asleep." William nodded, stood up from the sofa, and allowed Steve to walk him back upstairs to his room. The experience got Steve off to an awkward start. For the first few weeks, he was uncomfortable around the residents. Gradually, as he lived among them and heard their life stories, he began knowing them as individuals. Lois, for example, had only stubble on her scalp when she moved into the group home. She had been exiled as a child to a large state-run institution where it was standard practice to shave everyone's head. She was also forcibly sterilized during her teen years, destroying forever her dream of having a family. Steve never forgot how Lois talked about this trauma, how she sobbed and raged over it, as would any woman grieving and struggling to come to terms with personal tragedy. Her mental disability did not make her any less female, less human, or less susceptible to pain. Over the next few years, Steve watched Lois blossom in the group home setting. She grew her hair to her shoulders. Later, she got a job, moved into an apartment, fell in love, and married. Steve discovered that he was drawn to the people of the group home. He connected with their dreams, thoughts, and talents. Further, he was able to help them to carve their place in the world and to build lives filled with purpose and pleasure. Discarding business as a career, Steve declared his major in behavioral psychology. Graduating from the college, Steve turned his passion into his career. He landed a position directing programs for the developmentally disabled in Virginia. At the same time, he began studying for a master's degree in rehabilitative counseling. He started his coursework with a 2-week session on normalization at Syracuse University, led by one of its pioneers, Dr. Wolfensberger. In that setting, Steve began to consider, in a wider context, what he had learned at the group home. He listened raptly as Dr. Wolfensberger and other professors explained how society can identify particular groups of people as apart from the norm, and how placing less value on them can lead to humiliation, mistreatment, and deprivation of rights, up to and including their right to live. Decades later, Steve says, understanding how social and political practices can deny the validity of individuals changed me in a fundamental way. As part of his studies, he visited large state institutions for the mentally handicapped to collect research for Dr. Wolfensberger. Lois and other residents at the group home had told Steve about these places. In fact, many of his residents had come from these institutions as part of an early wave in the movement to bring the mentally handicapped into the mainstream of life. Hearing about them did not prepare him for seeing them. They were horror shows. Long afterwards, what he witnessed remained sharp in his memory. The staff would unlock big, heavy double doors, and you'd walk through them into the wards. You would find people half naked, sometimes sitting in their feces. They would be crying, yelling, rocking, and no one was paying any attention. I was in shock that human beings could be treated this way. The normalization theory of Benjit Nirji and Dr. Wolfensberger became Steve's holy grail. Living in the group home, he regarded his residents as individuals with worth, not as social outcasts. But he understood the continuing peril they would be in until society as a whole embraced them. In 1980, Steve moved to California, where he became program director for the developmentally disabled and psychiatric wings of Georgian Court, a private healthcare facility. Years later, when Georgian Court changed hands, the new owners converted it to a geriatric care center. Steve never planned to work in geriatrics, but he stayed on at the Georgian Court while he searched for a job in rehabilitation for the mentally disabled. It was difficult. He recoiled at how the new management at Georgian Court cared for its residents. They were kept clean and fed. Their medications were given as needed, but the staff barely knew their names, let alone anything about them as individuals. The patients spent their days tied into wheelchairs lining Georgian Court's hallways, backs to the wall and eyes looking blankly into space. Couldn't we at least turn the wheelchairs so that the people face each other, so they have eye contact, maybe even talk to each other? Steve asked at a management meeting. The executives blinked, baffled. Their puzzlement soon turned to irritation as the young interloper offered more ideas in subsequent gatherings. After 6 months, Steve left Georgian Court to direct a large organization of residences and rehabilitation programs for the mentally disabled. 3 years passed, and the work he thought he would never do again tapped him on the shoulder. The previous owner of Georgian Court was on the phone. He now worked for a company planning to convert a skilled nursing facility into a residence dedicated to Alzheimer's care, called Parkside Special Care Center. It would be the first of its kind in Southern California. If Steve were interested in becoming its administrator, the company would pay for him to visit the best Alzheimer's care centers around the country. He would then be free to design his own program for Parkside. At first, Steve dismissed the idea. The career he had trained for was working with the developmentally disabled. Still, he had trouble putting the offer out of his mind. He always regretted his powerlessness to help the elderly residents he left behind at Georgian Court. This call out of the blue was a chance to make things right. If not for the people at Georgian Court, then at least for others facing a similar plight. He took the job. When Steve embarked on his first round of visits to Alzheimer's care facilities across the United States, he assumed he would return with pages of notes on practices to emulate, but his notepad remained empty. In all the facilities he visited, he might as well have been walking the halls of Georgian Court all over again. He saw the same rows of wheelchairs along hallways, the same lifeless stares by seniors lost in inactivity and anonymity. If these places were the gold standard in memory care, things were going to have to change. So far, Steve's field of developmental disability care was the only one using the principles of normalization. But Steve was convinced they would serve equally well in Alzheimer's care. After all, the memory impaired who were confined to nursing homes lost their social status just as the mentally disabled did, and they were exiled from the normality of the rest of the world, which considered them less than human. Steve was out to transform care for the memory impaired by restoring their normal. Parkside Special Care Center had tile floors, vinyl-covered furniture bolted to the floor, employees in white uniforms, and countless televisions blaring nonstop in front of motionless residents. If Steve were to reshape Parkside to his own vision of normalization, everything about the place would need to change, including the attitudes of the staff. The key to transforming Parkside would be having everyone on the same page. They needed to understand this was not a warehouse for the memory impaired. It was their home. So when Steve arrived at Parkside on his first day to the job, his golden retriever Jasper was at his side, because there's nothing more normal than having a dog around the house. While pet therapy would become an accepted practice in senior care in subsequent decades, it was unheard of the day Jasper trotted through the front hallway. Animals were considered a sanitation hazard, which could raise the eyebrows of state inspectors sky high, but in the interests of those in his care, he was more immediately concerned about the staff. Lori had been working in Parkside's medical records department for 2 years before Steve arrived. He had a totally different vision of what Parkside should be, and we took his changes as an insult to our work, she said. In meetings after meetings, Steve laid out his ideas to incredulous staff. The floors would be redone in a pattern the residents could follow to encourage them to walk. Colorful wallpaper, plush furniture, and leafy plants would turn the atmosphere from clinical to inviting. More dogs and cats would join Jasper, along with tanks of fish and cages of birds. Further, staff would keep the office doors open. If residents wandered in, invite them to sit down, Steve said. Your office is a room in their home. They have as much right to go there as you do. Residents would wear regular clothing during the day rather than bathrobes and slippers. We will need to call their families and ask them to bring in more of their clothes. All beds would be made by 9:30 a.m. because it's not normal to leave a bed unmade until the afternoon. Steve would pitch in to help, and so should the other managers if it looked like the deadline might not be met. And unless the residents are choosing to watch television, we'll turn the televisions off and get people involved in something meaningful. Steve's changes alarmed Pat, the activities director. She had trained diligently for her work, and she prided herself on it. Seeing she was upset, Steve sat down with her for a private conversation. Pat, think about what you would like to do with your friends, Steve said. When you get together, do you toss balloons? Do you stack blocks? Do you look at calendars and remind each other what day it is? It may be a well-intentioned effort to reorient the memory impaired to reality, but it simply causes confusion and stress. And how important is it that any of us know today's date? She was silent for a few minutes. She had to admit it made sense, but it contradicted everything she'd been taught. When Steve asked Pat to design the new engagement program, the prospect terrified her. I resigned 3 times in the first 6 months, but Steve always told me I couldn't leave, that the residents needed me, and he needed me. Soon, Parkside began to offer a program of activities unprecedented to those with memory impairment. Groups formed for residents to enjoy music, art, travel, and movies. Male residents were invited to put on ties and take part in men's club. Steve used his own money to buy ties for men who didn't have them. Many employees left. Those who stayed discovered new meaning in their work. Lori, the medical records staffer, said, "When I finally grasped what Steve was doing, I had more enthusiasm. Before, the people at Parkside were patients, not individuals I could get to know. I saw that when you give them the opportunity to engage, they do." Each day brought a gratifying surprise. Staff members learned that many residents considered incontinent were not. They required assistance getting to the bathroom, and they might not have had the verbal skills to ask for help, but they communicated their need through body language. Once staff identified its meaning, It was easy to understand and escort them to the bathroom when needed. Liberation from the humiliation of incontinence was a powerful tonic for these residents. Steve constantly had to convince state inspectors that Parkside wasn't breaking rules. It was setting new standards of care. In less than a year, Parkside was transformed from a nursing home like any other into a sought-after establishment where families actually wanted their loved ones to reside. A waiting list developed. Within 3 years, Parkside's owners purchased a second nursing home for Steve to transform and manage. Suddenly, Alzheimer's care experts from around the country wanted to see this revolution for themselves. Conference organizers sought Steve as a speaker. He appeared at the White House Conference on Aging. By the time Steve stepped up to the podium at the Alzheimer's Symposium in San Diego, he had been leading this movement for a decade. In the 3 years before seeing Steve's presentation, I had spent nearly all my waking hours researching Alzheimer's care, with the intention of starting an organization dedicated to caring for people with memory disorders. I had read every medical journal I could get my hands on, visited facilities and memory impairment units, and peppered Alzheimer's experts with questions. The odyssey had been frustrating. Touted nursing homes turned out to be nothing more than the usual stinky warehouse-like places where the managers counted the peas on the residents' plates to make sure they weren't exceeding their budgets. I wanted to liberate the memory impaired from this, not condemn them to it. For too long, Alzheimer's patients had been written off as afflicted, incapacitated cases without hope. I knew them as people with interest, desires, and potential. To help with the complex financial and real estate issues involved in launching the company I envisioned, I enlisted longtime CPC colleague Jim Smith. Both of us knew the organization would only come to life the way we envisioned if we could find the right person to lead resident care. Someone who would smile in agreement when I talked about providing meaningful lives to people with memory impairment. So far, everyone we had interviewed had looked puzzled at best and aghast at worst when I described my plans.